This is Caught in the Act with Tim Clarke.
Welcome back. Better Call Saul, Law and Order SVU, Frasier, The Mandalorian, even The Simpsons. Spin-off shows that were at least the equal of the original. Familiar characters in different scenarios, but existing in the same universe, and with viewers keen to carry on with the story. Last week, in dueling courtrooms in different states, the judicial equivalent of those shows, of that universe, was playing out. Spin-offs from the original drama, which was, and still is, Brittany Higgins versus Bruce Lehrmann. Joining me again on Caught in the Act this week is one of the OGs of this very room, Jenna Clarke. Welcome back, Jenna.
I'm really earning a bit of a moniker that I just like to follow the celebrity trials, the pretty people trials.
Yeah, well, there's a very good living to be made out of that, so don't knock it. So, as we explored in Caught in the Act last year, the defamation trial of Mr. Lehrmann, the man accused by Ms. Higgins of raping her in Parliament House, reopened the wounds which have remained raw since that allegation was aired on The Project on Network 10 in 2021. That interview was, of course, conducted by then superstar presenter Lisa Wilkinson. The veteran journalist eventually became part of the story herself, particularly after a Logies speech which forced the delay of the criminal trial of Mr. Lehrmann. And last week, in a Sydney court, Ms. Wilkinson was not just part of the story, she was the story, as she took on her employer, Network 10, over her decision to get her own lawyers and what those lawyers cost. A spin-off, which again featured Justice Michael Lee, more explosive testimony from Miss Wilkinson, and some intriguing clues as to the ultimate outcome of Mr. Lehrmann's bid to clear his name and make Network 10 pay in the process. Meanwhile, in Canberra, another spin-off, another inquiry into how that aborted criminal trial was conducted, the performance of prosecutor Shane Drumgold, and whether an inquiry into him, conducted by another judge, was biased. And over here in the West, the names Higgins, Shiraz and Reynolds were also before a Supreme Court judge. Storylines everywhere. Jenna, we discussed this last year, of course, but this single drunken night in Canberra a few years ago continues to ripple across lives and careers and many, many courts.
It does. I shudder to think. Look, I think that this is probably Ally McBeal on steroids. As you said, there's so many storylines here. There's so many theories that can come out of it. I think, without a doubt, and we've spoken about it before, Tim, Justice Michael Lee probably is the star of the show with his zingers and one-liners.
Yeah,
when court resumed last week to hear this defamation proceeding about the cost issue between Ms. Wilkinson and obviously Channel 10, who's still her employer, which is quite interesting. He called in front of into the witness stand was to be a, in inverted commas, troll, an internet troll that decided to almost prejudice the trial on social media at the end of the year. And I think someone was running a little bit late, being the person that was supposed to appear. And I think the zinger was, what is this? Is this tea time at a suburban golf course? And you just knew that this is going to set the tone for how these next couple of weeks are going to roll out.
I love Justice Lee because he doesn't take a backward step. He doesn't suffer fools gladly. He's obviously hugely experienced, and he seems to have every section of the law just right on the tip of his tongue. He doesn't need to. I've watched the live stream. He doesn't need to consult books, or he's not looking at his screen. And there's mens reas and there's Latin phrases chucked in, but then seemingly, at the flick of a switch, he can then become the everyman and just tell everyone just to get on with it, or not get on with it, or or, where are we going with this? He cuts to the quick so well, and did, as I mentioned before, during the Palmer McGowan defamation case as well. He was just so on point that, to borrow an Ali McBeal type phrase, that he has become, obviously he's the central figure because he's going to decide it all, but he has become a little bit of a star of the show himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has been really interesting. I think this specific case of which we're focusing on now, this is basically, this is catnip for the legal fraternity because it basically involves some of the biggest names, the biggest silks, the biggest brains to ever sort of trot down Macquarie Street to the Supreme Court and the Federal Court. So, you've got Sue Crisantho, you've got Dr. Matt Collins, KC, you've got everyone involved here. So I shudder to think what the bills are going to be at the end of this. But it is interesting just to see, but this also, I think this is also the nexus of where to next for defamation law in this country when it comes to journalism. Because I think a lot of people are probably saying, this is a win for Wilkinson, but what's next? Where does this sort of end for, future stories and future cases where journalists, and it is sometimes the likely story where the journalists are generally named in any type of defamation proceedings. This isn't unusual.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it is becoming more prevalent that individual lawyers, and there's another case that I've been following here involving a football club and some very high-profile journalists in Melbourne, where they were individually named, and that brings with it all the legal hellfire that can possibly rain down, including hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage, reputational damage, time out of your already busy working day. I mean, all that. And it's obviously deliberate tactic by defamation plaintiffs. And as the judicial meanderings sort of weave their way across the country, those in Canberra still watching closely for the outcome of this, or have they sort of moved on a little bit? Yeah,
well, look, speaking of drunken nights out, I think we had a few recently. Clearly, we had a couple of sitting weeks where we had the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce lolling about on a street in Braddon, which is a very well-to-do suburb in Canberra, after allegedly having a couple of glasses of wine and mixing it with medication. And then we've recently just had the Deputy Leader of the National Party, Perrin Davey, going back into a Senate estimates hearing after 2 glasses of red. So I think the behaviour of the joint is still very much in focus. But this story, I think everyone is definitely watching to see what the outcome is, because, of course, the criminal trial was basically stayed due to the fact that Ms Higgins' health was the main concern for everyone involved. But the civil case has really gripped, I think, probably the plebs like me, because you can kind of watch it on YouTube, which is great. But the professional class will be interesting. And I think that the central player in this now being Senator Linda Reynolds from Western Australia, who is pursuing her own, as you mentioned. I think she will be watching this very closely. Interestingly, I think the only thing people are really concerned about in the Canberra bubble is that the payout that Brittany Higgins did receive, which has been touted as being a figure as high as $3 million. And that is also set to be, I think Ms Reynolds put it forward to this National Corruption Committee, which is set to kick off in the next couple of months.
Yeah, interesting that with all that went on, marches for justice and anything, it's the actual dollar figure that is going to be the next talking point. So, as we said, the last series of Lehrmann versus Higgins finished on a cliffhanger.
4 weeks after it was launched, Bruce Lehrmann's explosive defamation trial against Network 10 begins to wrap up this morning. Lawyers from both sides will present their closing submissions from today, ending what's been one of the most controversial court battles in years.
For several weeks, just before last Christmas, the conflicting accounts of Mr Lehrmann and Miss Higgins were dissected in intrinsic detail by opposing legal teams for both sides. And the third wheel was Ms Wilkinson, who is also being sued, as we've just mentioned, by Mr Lehrmann for her part in that TV package, which is where the spin-off starts. Such was the impact of Miss Wilkinson's interview that Mr Lehrmann was subsequently charged with rape by the ACT police, and the veteran broadcaster and her team won a Logie on the back of that interview.
4 incredibly intense, sleepless weeks later, when our story went to air, the entire country knew the name Brittany Higgins. As Brittany warned me before we went to air, her story would be seen by many of the most powerful people in this country, not as a human problem, but as a political problem. Brittany Higgins was a political problem, and governments tend to like political problems to go away. But Brittany never did. And the truth is, this honour belongs to Brittany.
The fallout of that acceptance speech for that Logie caused its own firestorm, given that it came just weeks before the scheduled trial of Mr. Lehrmann, ultimately resulting in that trial being significantly delayed. Eventually, the judge ruled the impact of Miss Wilkinson's words cut so deep that jurors might be tainted. Then, public opinion turned against Ms. Wilkinson, and so did Network 10, sacking her from the project. In response, Ms. Wilkinson lawyered up, hiring fearsome defamation barrister Sue Chrysanthu to represent her. And Ms. Chrysanthu does not come cheap. Ms. Wilkinson ultimately claimed that Network 10 should pay for her lawyer because she was left with no choice but to hire her. Network 10 resisted, hence the cross-claim and the rarest of insights into a behind-the-scenes brawl between TV bosses and a TV star. Jenna, we've both worked in and around a TV network, and I think it's fair to say that they like or would prefer to keep the inner workings of shows and relationships and wages of their stars as in-house as possible. But last week, Network 10's Dirty Laundry was aired very publicly. It wasn't comfortable viewing, well, but it wouldn't have been, particularly if you were still inside the Network 10 bubble.
No, especially if you were the CFO or the CEO of who were both named, in these affidavits that were submitted and then subsequently released as official evidence into these court cases. Again, and just the timing of it as well. So we have this issue where we learned that we don't know the figure of which Ms. Wilkinson was earning at Channel 10. She was only on air for about 3 to 4 days on the project. But we did learn one little nugget of information out of her contract and the affidavits. She had a wardrobe allowance of $100,000, which they decided to negotiate when she was taken off air to $40,000. But interestingly, due to taxation law, if you're going to adhere to that, you have to leave all of those clothes right in the wardrobe when you're not in front of a camera. Yep. So I think not only are we going to see a change in the way that journos maybe approach their stories moving forward, I think TV networks are definitely going to be looking at their contracts.
And I can see some other higher profile female stars maybe going to their agent and saying, excuse me, she was getting 40 grand and she's not even on the bloody telly. Exactly. I'm down bloody Primark on a Sunday, sort of looking for the knockoffs.
Yeah, look, a shout out to Zara and H&M. That's all we wear on telly these days.
40 grand. And a very senior female journalist, I know this for a fact, once got audited in this state because of her wardrobe and had to prove to the tax office that all the clothes that were in her wardrobe she'd actually worn on air, and the ones she hadn't had to basically go to the tax office, I believe, or certainly get put back into a wardrobe somewhere. So Brilliant. The ATO does take this stuff seriously,
especially if you are a high profile person.
Yeah, but the bigger point, I think, $100 grand for wardrobe shows the measure of esteem that Lisa Wilkinson was once held in Channel 10 or Network 10 and the project in particular when she got that job.
Yeah.
So then reading and being able to read all the emails and the raw, visceral way that she felt after she basically got dumped for this Logie speech. And her main legal argument was always, it wasn't just me. And the media commentary was, Lisa Wilkinson, who does she think she is? She just gets up on stage, rambles on. She knew the trial was coming. God, what an idiot! How can she do it? She's one of the best, or supposed to be. Whereas her argument was, actually, I ran it through the lawyers. There was several lawyers, and right up until 4:30 before the speech, I was getting emails saying it's fine. And Network 10 basically let the bus run over her and then back up and run over her again. And that was the point of her getting her own lawyers, because she basically felt that she'd been hung out to dry.
Oh, and I think she'd felt, verbally handcuffed, essentially, because she couldn't, she wanted them to release statements and things like that. I think that, she did say she felt gutted because she took the stand again last week. She felt gutted. She felt her reputation was continuously being trashed. And of course, that's one of the central tenets of defamation, because you need to protect a reputation, which was, before all this, pretty firmly intact. As you said, she was one of the best presenters. But it also just goes to show what on earth was going through the minds of these lawyers. And I've spoken to a number of people that are not within the case but close to the case, and they sort of say this is probably just lawyers, because we saw in-house counsel for 10 also front up to give evidence about why they decided to, were they embarrassed by giving her that advice? Because I think any sort of journo, regardless if you've covered courts or not, would probably know probably not a good idea to maybe poke the bear before just a few weeks before a trial. I think it is important to note that Samantha Maiden, who worked with Brittany Higgins as well for the news.com.au version of that story, won the Gold Walkley that year. Yep. She stood up and made a very responsible speech about, I just want to thank everyone involved, and that's all I'll say, because I don't want to, heaven forbid, prejudice the trial. And
that was a spin-off that was cancelled because she was sued as well, as was news.com.au, but they settled before the trial commenced. Yes,
they were. So look, again, once a spin-off that I think this trial is going to have so many spin-offs, it's ridiculous. It's kind of like Seinfeld, it's never going to end. But yeah, Ms. Wilkinson, I think just the one thing she just wanted was support from her employer to show that I had it, this was checked off by in-house counsel twice, as you said. But again, I think Justice Lee successfully skewered Channel 10's in-house legal counsel, saying, well, you did not waive a privilege, so I didn't see the advice that you gave her. Henceforth, cough up all your cash, you're paying for Sue Crisantho.
Yeah. And look, there's no doubt that the low point for Lisa Wilkinson was basically the day after a very professional high point in winning a Logie. Wilkinson learning basically weeks later through her agent that she'd been dumped from her show, despite having more than 2 years left to run on that contract. The spin from 10 was that the flagship news show needed a rebrand with new presenters. The reality, the stain from the Logie speech, couldn't be washed off until Wilkinson was brushed off. And so she was, exiting with a swipe at the media on the way out.
But I also have to be honest with you. The last 6 months have not been easy. And the relentless, targeted toxicity by some sections of the media has taken a toll, not just on me, but on people I love. Don't get me wrong, I'm not above criticism, far from it. I'm human, and I don't always get it right. None of us do. But by God, I've tried.
You can tell, I think, in her voice, Lisa Wilkinson truly felt that sentiment. But what her affidavit and her evidence last week uncracked in court was the private fury she felt at her bosses for dumping her from her prime job and letting her take the blame for derailing that criminal trial. Jenna, if I know you, you would have been glued to this evidence last week. So give us your impression, or tell us what she said, but then give us your impression of how she came across while she was saying it.
I think there's been a lot of confusion because we had the release of some text messages between the CEO of Channel 10, Beverly McGarvey, between Wilkinson. And I think, Beverly allegedly texted Lisa after the delivery of that very speech on the project saying, perfect delivery, great job. But I think it's been caught up, whether it be in the rumour mill or whatever, that was actually sent to Lisa after the Logie speech, which was incorrect. I think, when you look at all of the evidence where that, her barristers were saying, Ms. Wilkinson has never been a news journalist. She's never been a court reporter. So you need to forgive her for not knowing, process. And then, coming and then presenting this Logie speech, you just sort of go, I just think, and this is only my opinion, I think there was a lot of ego involved in that story. And we're seeing it even also where, we saw on Friday with the released documents from the federal court once again. She was tipped off by David Shiraz, who is Brittany Higgins' partner, that the DPP would be, basically calling off the criminal trial due to Brittany's mental health and health and general well-being. Tipped her off days before, and then that was confidential information to start with. Then he passed it on. But then Lisa wanted Channel 10 to release a statement. So I think that's the only time that the Channel 10 lawyers really gained some probably an upper hand saying, duh, it's confidential. Absolutely not.
Yeah. Having covered the trial, the defamation trial before Christmas and this last week, ego, absolutely. It's definitely in there. And look, network news television is highly competitive. We all know that. All news is highly competitive, but particularly on the TV. And Network 10 has always seen itself as the poor brother, battling along behind the giants, even though they're funded by Paramount, by the way. So this was obviously a big moment for the whole show, and it was a big interview, no doubt about it. But again, I like just listening to it just then. You think, oh God, did it not twig with anyone? And your point there is absolutely right. Is that Network 10 refused to waive the privilege, so that means no one gets to see the actual advice that they gave. But Tasha Smithies, who was the in-house counsel, was asked, well, okay, we might not see the precise advice, but are you embarrassed that you gave it? Do you think you dropped the ball here? And Justice Lee said, I'm left in the dark, so I have to assume what that advice was. And given the speech was made in the form it was, I have to assume that the advice wasn't that great, which is an interesting position for a judge to be put in, and certainly an interesting position for an in-house counsel to be put in on the witness stand on oath. But I personally think that Lisa Wilkinson came out of last week better than she went into it. But there's still a little bit of a pox on all their houses, in my view, anyway, in terms of the way that was dealt with, particularly before the criminal trial. Absolutely.
I think there were so many tentacles involved in this story, and now there's so many fingers being pointed. And also, I just think it goes, not only is it ego with the media fraternity, and we all have one, I probably have one of the biggest, but it's also the legal fraternity, because there was an issue, and there are rumblings with the fact that they didn't want, as they said, anyone but Sue Crisantho, because she is a very successful lawyer, but also, of course, Wilkinson's like, well, I'm going to lawyer up. I want the best. And so it was almost like a tit for tat between the in-house counsel, who didn't like Ms. Crisantho.
Well, they went worse than that. They said it's the worst possible lawyer you could have, and not just because she costs $11,000 a day, although that would have, that would have pricked up the ears of the CFO. But there was, professional rivalries, other previous cases, and then very unedifying letter from Brittany Higgins' lawyer to say, we're not going to be dealing with Sue Crisantho either. And that was, as I read it, a hangover from the Christian Porter case and some other cases that their lawyers had been sort of battling with her as well. So, yeah, that Spider-Man meme comes into mind, is that everyone was just standing around looking at each other, pointing and going, well, what the hell are we going to do?
Exactly. And I think Justice Lee is tearing his hair out. I mean, even he confessed that he was working Christmas Day when more evidence was landing in his inbox. And that's why he's basically given no one a free pass. You can sort of tell the people in the witness stand that he has a bit of disdain for or expects more from. He's been very gentle with, the likes of Ms. Higgins' parents and things like that, because of course these people are just bystanders in this whole circus. But I think all he wants is open justice, because he wants to put this to bed once and for all. And the only way to do that is by having everything out on the table for him to thrash out in his judgment in the next couple of months.
Yeah. And obviously, media sackings, we know, they can be brutal. I've seen it. We've been around desks in newsrooms which are, full of plants and papers one day and just, Marie Celeste the next. But I can't remember in recent times such a high-profile media axing subsequently becoming so public. And I suppose we have Justice Lee to thank for that, because he's been very clear from day one, unless it's legal professional privilege, it's out there and it's going online, and there's the online file which is updating every day. And Friday there was this ream of emails and texts and that came through, which so some of it really personal stuff. Just highlighted how brutal this became.
Oh, brutal. And there was so many cooks in the kitchen in terms of, the CEO was trying to text Ms. Wilkinson, but then obviously having no luck in getting through, so then was going through her agent. And then I think 10 offered up a number of counselling sessions because the CEO especially was worried about Ms. Wilkinson's mental health. There was claims that Ms. Wilkinson was on the phone sobbing and things like that. These are claims that she has denied. So it just goes to show that, when big names, big egos get in the way, and at the end of the day, like you say, this one drunken night in Canberra has just caused the biggest political, legal and media shitfight we have seen in living memory.
Yeah. Now, talking of egos, one of those who jumped on the pile atop Lisa Wilkinson in the days after that Logies speech was Dr. Matt Collins, a defamation barrister so renowned he has actually written the book on that area of law in Australia. On Sunrise and on 2 other shows, Dr. Collins was asked about that Logies speech and he didn't pull any punches.
It's not just the risk of prejudicing a jury, but there can also be risks to the reputations of individuals. Clearly, this was ill-advised.
In her evidence, Ms. Wilkinson said that criticism was particularly hurtful, given Dr. Collins' standing in the legal fraternity. She said she was desperate for 10 to correct the record and make it clear they had cleared that speech. And then, days later, Network 10 hired Dr. Collins to represent them and the woman whose speech he had labelled ill-advised. 10 explained, or tried to explain, that part of that was to prevent Dr. Collins saying anything else critical in public. But it left Lisa Wilkinson feeling torn. How could she let someone represent her who had been openly critical of her just days before? So she didn't. To her new solicitor, Miss Wilkinson said she felt isolated, unprotected and abandoned by Network 10. She was told by 10's lawyers that the network's interest now trumped hers. And in February 2023, Wilkinson was not informed by 10 that she was being personally sued by Bruce Lehrmann. She found that out from reading it on the front of Jenna's newspaper. Ultimately, Ms. Wilkinson chose Ms. Chrysanthou, the woman who defended Christian Porter against his own career curtailing allegations. 10's lawyers said that they were the last lawyers in Australia they wanted Wilkinson to go with, and ultimately they said they wouldn't pay a cent, let alone the $700,000 that's been racked up to date in legal costs. And so, to court. Jenna, we've all been irked by our bosses at times, but this fallout between Wilkinson and 10 went absolutely nuclear.
Oh, absolutely. Again, Justice Lee asked Tash, Miss Smithers, whether she was embarrassed. I think that wasn't just about not waiving privilege or that advice. It was about the fact that basically, I don't even know how to put it in sort of, so journo terms, that would be like Joan Didion saying, you did a terrible job at that column, Jenna, Tim. Basically, if Dr. Collins said it was ill-advised, you would probably want to crawl in a professional hole and never get out. So I think there is definitely a lot of beef between all of the lawyers going on here, but there's the fact that the fallout is just continues to spiral, but also Lisa not realising that she, being so prominent, would not be named also maybe just goes to show how naive she probably is to the fact of just how the sausage is really made. Yeah.
And on the one hand, she was saying, I was completely reliant on 10's lawyers. They told me the speech was cool. I went with it. You know, they vetted it. They redlined one little bit of it, but ultimately it was fine. And then to have those same lawyers basically turn on you as soon as you're out the door and say, well, actually, we're not for you now. We are for the bigger, the logo on the front of the building and not the face on the side of the bus. I mean, that would be devastating on several levels, and we found out that Lisa Wilkinson was genuinely fearful she was going to lose her beautiful home because, legal costs and damages and potential. And there was the email that detailed this furious, tearful, tense phone call between Lisa Wilkinson and the lawyers, where it was, they came to the conclusion all she's worried about are costs and her own reputation, which was brutal in its own way. And look, I think I was probably guilty in the last time we had this talk about criticising her as a senior journalist for giving that speech at the time, and I still stand by some of that criticism. You can't, in all good standing, just say, the lawyers told me it was okay. I mean, we know Lisa Wilkinson is a very independent, fierce, free-thinking, intelligent woman. So it can't have not crossed her mind to do it. But it turns out 10 was just as culpable and then culpable of just chucking their star under the bus.
Yeah. Look, when it comes to ineptitude, I think there's probably a lot to be said about Wilkinson's journalistic credibility, but I think more so what's going on in the in-house counsel at Channel 10 at this point in time, not to mention the accounts department as well.
Yeah, that's right. Now, lawyers grilling other lawyers in court, that's always an interesting exhibition. The language is always measured, there's courtesy and there's politeness, but the intent to win is always there, and the ego is always there, both barely under the surface. So it was when Tasha Smithies, 10's senior counsel, was called to give evidence last week and called upon to explain why 10 had acted the way they did. She was grilled, in fact, about their reinforcement of Wilkinson needing to give a speech at the Logies, lest she be seen as wavering in her support of Brittany Higgins, about their reluctance to release a statement about their part in that Logies speech, about their refusal to waive that privilege so the exact advice given to Wilkinson could be seen. And ultimately, she was also grilled about their rewind in position on paying Wilkinson's massive legal costs. As you've mentioned, Jenna, Ms. Smithies refused to accept that she was embarrassed about giving that advice that the Logie speech was okay and green-lighting it, in effect. And she also refused to accept the reason the privilege was not waived was so 10 could save what little face they had left, really.
The face of an infant. Yeah, look, she had a shocker. She had an absolute shocker. Of all of them that came out terribly last week, it was definitely Miss Smithies, that's for sure. Look, I just think the really interesting part of that is the fact that when you don't, especially if you know the shtick of Justice Lee, he wants everything out in the open, as you've said numerous times, so he can get to the bottom of what's going on. And the fact that there was just complete ineptitude at every level here with all of with the legal advice, the journalism that happened, but also the fact that the embarrassment of 10 then walking away at the 11th hour saying, okay, we're just embarrassed now. These who would relatively be unknown lawyers and unknown names, embarrassed them on the stand, added further cost to this exorbitantly expensive trial, and they've walked away at the 11th hour saying, actually, we've reviewed our options and, yeah, fine, we'll pay.
And that must have been truly very embarrassing, not only for Tasha Smithies, but for the lawyers that were representing 10 in front of Justice Lee, to have to front up after lunch and say, actually, Your Honour, we've revised our position and we now agree that we should pay Lisa Wilkinson's costs. It's just... Barrister Michael Elliott, who was representing Ms. Wilkinson last week, called the network's reasoning one pathetic excuse after another as to why we couldn't learn the truth. And then after that grilling and that posturing came the closing, when Ms. Chrysanthou hammered home that there was no way Ms. Wilkinson could have used 10's lawyers because she didn't trust them or the network, so they should have to pay. And ultimately, after that back down, Justice Lee said, yeah, open your wallet.
Channel 10 has been dealt an expensive blow after Lisa Wilkinson won a heated court battle against the network. It all came down to who should cover her monster legal bill in the defamation action brought by Bruce Lehrmann. The TV personality told the court she recruited her own lawyers because she didn't think the network's team were acting in her best interests. The judge ruled that was a reasonable move. But just how much 10 will have to pay won't be known until the case is over.
Another zinger from Michael Elliott SC summed it up. This is not just a capitulation, this is an embarrassment under which we have been led on a merry dance right back to where we started almost a year ago. So, Jenna, not only a big financial win for Ms Wilkinson, but it pulled back the curtain on what went on before and after she left the project, and I've got to say left me with certainly a better understanding of exactly what happened and some sympathy for what she's been through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when networks sign on these big talent who, you know, they've been around the block, they know how to best present themselves, they know how best to promote themselves. When you're not listening to the talent like that, when they're feeling very aggravated, it just goes to show that things can go bad very, very, very quickly. And I do feel a certain amount of sympathy for Ms Wilkinson because I can't imagine how horrible it must have been feeling. But I think her intentions were very pure with this story. She wanted to, not to maybe put herself up to be a bit of a feminist icon, but I think she definitely has her heart is in the right place to move the dial on gender issues in this country. But maybe just don't do it. Do it as an activist, not as a journalist. But also with Channel 10 last week, not only this is coming down the pike, they've just announced that they're doing staff layoffs. At this point in time, it is just a mess. Yeah,
that was very unfortunate timing, obviously for the staff that are going to lose their jobs. But you know, it's very easy then to conflate the two, and some staff maybe over a glass of Merlot on Friday night going, oh, well, we've got to pay bloody Lisa's legal costs now, so I've got to go and find another job.
Exactly.
I don't know, that might be too simplistic. I mean, reading again all the material, you're absolutely right. Lisa Wilkinson tried to do the best on what was a very important story. She got too close to it, absolutely. She was much too close to David Shiraz, Brittany Higgins' now fiancé, I believe, in my opinion, looking at some of the emails, the very early emails that Mr. Shiraz signed off much love. And that is a red flag. It's very easy, and gosh, I know I have been in very recent times. You get when you get so embedded in a story, and you hope it turns out a certain way. It's very easy then to slip over into becoming supporter and not reporter. And it's the lesson that I try and relearn myself, you know, when I'm going through that. Sit at the back, sit further back, literally physically in the court, because that sometimes helps keep a physical distance. And it sounds funny, but it works for me. And that's what I try and tell some of the young reporters that we come across. You're bound to get close. It's bound to affect you, whatever you're writing about, but try and find a way to keep the distance. And in this case, I believe Ms Wilkinson got too close to it and then couldn't see the wood for the trees, and also couldn't see past the potential, you know, career-defining story that it's become, but for different reasons. Yeah,
and it's also, I mean, I just sort of listening to the testimony and all of the barbs that were exchanged early last week. When you hear the words, you know, Logies, TV Week was being quoted in the federal court, you're like, this is Australia. This is it. This is where we're at. And you just sort of think it's just disappointing that this whole thing has blown up. And we're just focused solely on this case and not actually talking about, you know, again, what I'm assuming Ms Higgins and Wilkinson decided to do this story for, and talk about victims in situations of, you know, sexual assault, sexual harassment that have no voice. Yeah.
And so, as that one spin-off show abruptly came to an end in Sydney, others continued. In Canberra, the skirmish between former ACT DPP Shane Drumgold and Walter Sofronoff, the judge who lambasted the way he handled Bruce Lehrmann's rape trial, continued. That hearing focused on Justice Sofronow's own conduct through his own inquiry, including his regular contact with journalists during those hearings. Hours of phone calls between him and various journos, prime among them the Australian's Janet Albrechtsen, led to allegations of bias and of Justice Sofronow's independence being poisoned by the contact with a reporter with an axe to grind. That hearing will continue. And here in Perth, a potentially explosive new episode crept a little closer. The cases of Linda Reynolds versus Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz came before the WA Supreme Court again. They are also defamation actions alleging the former junior media advisor and her fiancé trashed the reputation of the former Defence Minister in various of their social media posts. Justice Marcus Solomon has repeatedly urged all three sides to try and settle their differences out of court ahead of a possible trial in July, and he did so again last week, while flagging a delay in planned mediation until after Justice Lee hands down his ruling on the other side of the country. After that happens, it is entirely possible that mediation will go ahead, face-to-face in a room in Perth, meaning Miss Higgins and her partner will have to fly back from their new home in France, back to the city where Miss Higgins says she was close to suicide in the months after that alleged rape by Mr. Lehrmann. Jenna, we've recently learned also that Senator Reynolds won't be contesting the next federal election. Do you think the Higgins furore has fed into that decision?
I believe so, because my understanding is the reason why Senator Reynolds decided to launch her own independent defamation action is because she would potentially be seeking pre-selection for the Senate once again to go around again. But now, and of course, and I know I sat in a couple of those initial hearings in front of Justice Solomon where her lawyers sort of said, well, the reason why we want to have it heard here in Western Australia is because this is where the Senator needs to sort of make sure that her reputation is glistening. It will be interesting to see how mediation goes moving forward. And I don't think she's fighting just for her. I think she's also fighting on behalf of her former Chief of Staff, Fiona Brown, who gave evidence in the defamation trial for Lehrmann v. 10 and Wilkinson. I think she's just very aggrieved by how she was treated. I think this is probably another Wilkinson 10 situation where she was aggrieved by what was happening in the PMO's office. She was upset with how she was portrayed by Higgins and the now Labor government. So it will be interesting to see whether her decision to step away from public life will impact the proceedings moving forward.
And it's dovetail that with Ms Reynolds bringing the parliamentary action to look into Ms Higgins' ultimate payout from the government, which was $3 million awarded after one day, I think, of mediation. And I think Senator Reynolds' main issue with that is the allegations that Miss Higgins was making in that work club claim were never tested. They were never tested.
Exactly. And that has been one bee that has been stuck in Senator Reynolds' bonnet, understandably so, because, I mean, as we've heard in media reports, numerous media reports, and also evidence that she tended to the criminal trial, as well as Senator Michaelia Cash, who Ms Higgins also worked for, they both wanted to not challenge the allegations, but just give their side of the story. And the fact that it appears to the opposition that this has just been a political problem now handled by the Albanese government, and they have made it go away, and they have done anything but, because now I think if this isn't the first case that NAC, the National Anti-Corruption Commission, looks into, I think there will be absolute fireworks in the Senate.
Yeah. Well, I think what it all ensures is that there's plenty more spin-off episodes to come, which I hope will mean that we get to talk about it again, because it's not only fascinating to get your version of it, but I think it just bears more conversation, even though it's been hanging around for a long time, because it's just one of those cases that has impacted everyone involved, but also the wider community in so many ways.
Absolutely. And I think I was speaking to a number of specialist defamation lawyers over in Sydney over the weekend, and the two interesting facts that I sort of learned is that they probably, a majority of them, will now reconsider ever individually naming journalists involved in legal action, maybe to kind of move this circus away from heaven forbid, having a sequel. And also the fact that you just know that this entire chapter in Australian history is going to fuel so many book sales moving forward, but they are all under the understanding that, Ms. Wilkinson could now potentially move to the public broadcaster, the only person or the only organisation she hasn't worked for in the media, but she'll probably, she'll be fronting the public again at a writers' festival in Cairns in the next couple of weeks to talk about her book, remember?
Oh, yeah. Which she was writing during that very first email with Mr. Shiraz. I've just put down my manuscript to talk to you, David.
Exactly.
She wishes she just kept her head in the laptop.
I don't know whether it is, again, just adding into the absolute tragedy, a comic tragedy of this tale. I think it's called It Didn't Have to End Like This.
Yeah, well, I just hope she's got some very good lawyers to look over the book before it hits our shelves. Jenna, thanks so much for coming in, mate.
Thanks.
Lovely to see you and lovely to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Tim.
And thanks again to all the listeners. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to with any suggestions. courtintheact@wanews.com.au. Please don't forget to like and subscribe the podcasts and tell your mates we're here too. And remember, if you want to know what's going on in court, don't get caught short. Get caught in the act instead. See you next week.